Dear delegates and speakers, I, Rahul Patil from Macleods Pharma Division, welcome each one of you for this webinar on interesting subject titled Decoding PIH. Today we have with us very two eminent speakers who actually doesn't require any introduction, Dr. Sanjay Gupte from Pune and Dr. Hema Divakar from Bangalore. I also like to welcome Dr. Rakesh Singh from Noida, who will be moderating the session and taking us through the Q&A. Now I hand over the session to Dr. Aditi for the further proceedings.
Thank you, Mr. Rahul. So I'm here to welcome Dr. Rakhi Singh, who is a moderator for today's session. As for Dr. Rakhi Singh, she does not need any introduction. Ma'am is currently a director and senior gynecologist and IVF specialist at Abalone Clinic and IVF Center in Noida. And she's also currently a chairperson of Endocrinology Committee, FOXY. Ma'am has also been a former president of NOGS and a joint secretary of UP chapter ISAR, and also former joint secretary North Zone UA FOXY. Over to you, ma'am, for the further proceedings, and welcome to the program.
Thank you, Aditi. I welcome you all my dear delegates, to the most learned program and academic program on preterm labor. Let's learn about preterm labor from none other than Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who's going to talk at length and give us the in-depth knowledge about it. Dr. Sanjay Gupta is the director of Green Ray Genomic Research and Solutions, ethical chair for FIGO, International Federation of Ops and Gynae, what we know of. And we know him as an ethically correct person, and he is always there for us for all the help for the ethics and matters. And Sanjay Gupta sir has been the Secretary General of World Justice Organization, has been awarded FRCOG by the Royal College of London in 2010, President of FOXY 2010, President DIPSI 2013, which is the Diabetes in Pregnancy Study Group in India, Chairman Technical Research Committee of Indian Council of Medical Research, National Coordinator, National Eclampsia Registry, ex-chairperson of Ethics Committee of Maharashtra and Medical Council, ex-chairperson of Central Supervisory Board of PCPNDT Act, ex-member of Ethics Committee, Medical Council of India, national consultant in medical, legal and ethics issues in Ops and Gynae, ex-honorary professor and postgraduate teacher of Ops and Gynae. Who would do more justice to our topic of preeclampsia, where we stand and where we are going? I present to you Dr. Sanjay Gupta for the talk.
Thank you, Dr. Rakhi, for those kind words. It's good to have you in the chair, and my very close friend, Dr. Hema, is the co-speaker today. You know, you might be a little surprised why this particular topic, where we stand and where we are going. And in a minute, I'm going to explain to you why this particular topic. The National Eclampsia Registry of FOXY ICOG statistics reveals that incidence of hypertensive diseases is quite massive. In fact, in our country, incidence of preeclampsia was found to be 10.3% and incidence of eclampsia 1.9% of all the pregnancies. That means, as in India, we have 26 million deliveries per year. We are dealing with 26,78,000 cases of preeclampsia and 4,94,000 cases of eclampsia yearly. So truly a gigantic task that we need to handle. However, in spite of tremendous research over the years, hypertensive diseases in pregnancy and especially preeclampsia have remained an enigma, and the treatment of this condition still eludes us. That is why it's important to ponder over where we stand today and where we are going as far as preeclampsia is concerned. And we know that this is the new definition of preeclampsia. This was brought in 2014. And what does it say? Hypertension developing after 20 weeks of gestation with one or more of the following, that is proteinuria, maternal organ dysfunction, including renal, hepatic, hematological or neurological complications, or fetal growth restriction. So it is important here to note that this definition does not require proteinuria to meet the diagnostic criteria. The inclusion of fetal growth restriction in this definition may increase the number of women meeting the diagnostic criteria for preeclampsia and is therefore a significant change. Now let's first study and find out why was it called preeclampsia in the first place. Because for 1,000 years eclampsia was known as a convulsive disorder in pregnancy, and this is right from Hippocrates time. And it was noted then that this eclampsia was associated with hypertension, and it was always accompanied by proteinuria. And even without seizures, it indicated a potentially rapid progressive disease leading to maternal and infant morbidity and mortality. So they realized at that time that yes, there was hypertension, then proteinuria, and then there used to be seizures, and that's why it was called as seizure with seizures eclampsia, without seizures preeclampsia. But if we look at it closely, this was just kind of an accidental finding. Because it just happened so that before eclampsia there was hypertension and there was proteinuria. But these findings were not either sensitive nor were they specific for this condition, and not even the most important pathophysiological or prognostic factors for this particular condition. So nonetheless, the research was focused only on understanding of their cause, that is, why hypertension and why proteinuria for 100 years. And not surprisingly, no progress was made for a long time in finding the causes. So what happened? Preeclampsia became a disease of theories. And many theories, from worms to toxins and lightning to direction of the North Pole, were entertained. And Zussman in 1964 has beautifully described this as, he said, the preeclamptic woman has been blistered, bled, purged, packed, lavaged, irrigated, punctured, starved, sedated, anesthetized, paralyzed, tranquilized, rendered hypotensive, drowned, dehydrated, given diuretics, mammectomized, oophorectomized, and forcibly delivered. So everything possible on earth, was done to try and see whether a cure can be obtained or eclampsia can be, prevented. It took many years to realize that preeclampsia is not only pregnancy-induced hypertension. In the last 40 years, however, there has been an explosion in knowledge relevant to the understanding of preeclampsia. Now it is recognized that preeclampsia is a multi-systemic syndrome. And two individuals, really doyens in this field, Dr. Jim Roberts and Dr. Redman, really made the difference. Roberts first propagated the endothelial dysfunction theory, and Redman, showed how increased inflammatory activation matters. Then Hubel in 2006 propagated and showed that there are profound metabolic changes in these patients. In an abnormal balance of angiogenic and anti-angiogenic factors was brought forward by Maynard and Kurunanchi in 2011. And this has made a huge difference in diagnosis and prediction of the preeclampsia now. Furthermore, there has been a substantial increase in the understanding of process of trophoblast invasion, long recognized as a key feature of preeclampsia. And this was, propagated by Kaufman as long back as 2003. But the paradox that we are looking at is, in spite of more understanding of pathophysiology, the ability to predict, prevent, or treat preeclampsia has not really increased much. Presently, we so-called treat preeclampsia. What we are actually doing is we are only treating the symptoms and not the cause. It's like, giving paracetamol for fever without knowing, why the fever is there. This is so because when preeclampsia is clinically evident, the process is no more reversible. So the question to be answered is, if we know so much about preeclampsia, why haven't we been able to cure it? And to answer it, we need to do some rethinking on the whole process of this preeclampsia. So let's look at it differently. Etiologically, preeclampsia develops in 2 stages that we know. Asymptomatic stage involves abnormal placentation, which is followed by placental elaboration of soluble factors that enter the maternal circulation and cause widespread endothelial dysfunction with signs and symptoms, the so-called maternal syndrome. And of course, no talk on preeclampsia can be without this particular slide, which shows the failed remodeling of the placental vasculature. As you see, this is the normal vasculature, and then in preeclampsia, the vessels do not get invaded, and that's why they do not get dilated as they do in normal pregnancy. So what happens with this? The remodeling, we know that leads to increased diameter of the terminal vessels. And because of replacement of smooth muscles, sphincter-like action is reduced. This has been taught to us right from our postgraduate days. Original conclusion was this modeling leads to large increase in volume of the flow, but Burton in 2009 pointed out that flow is only increased 2 folds. They actually measured the flow and they said flow is only increased in normal pregnancy 2 folds. But what happens is velocity of the blood is actually reduced from 1 meter per second to 10 centimeters per second. So when remodeling is there, the flow is increased but not too much, but the velocity is definitely increased. So what happens when remodeling fails? The flow doesn't reduce too much, but the speed remains high, and that matters. And we are going to see how that matters. So immunologically, if we look at this, remodeling depends on tropoblastic invasion, which depend on decidual, that is maternal and trophoblast fetal antigen reaction. We know that the fetus tries to invade while the mother, though it wants to allow the fetus to get implanted and get nutrition, but doesn't like too much of a invasion. So this is achieved by immunological interaction, which is actually dealt with by HLA-G antigens. And these HLA-G antigens are protective antigens which are there on the trophoblast, and they provide the fetus protection from the NK cells in the maternal decidua, which otherwise would be harming the fetal cells. This is where importance of exposure to paternal antigen is intriguingly involved. What we say about is primary paternity. That means when the partner is changed, then the preeclampsia is more likely because the immunogenicity is of a different time. And this was proved by Lobillard in 1999. And now we know that when there is home donor pregnancy, where there is more of immunogenicity because the egg is also foreign to the mother and sperm is also foreign to the mother, then in that case, the chances of preeclampsia are comparatively very high. So this proves this theory of immunogenicity. What happens? Because of the inadequate perfusion that we saw, inadequate perfusion leads to many effects like intermittent hypoxia, which causes oxidative stress, which is followed by release of anti-angiogenic proteins like we know split and endoglin. Then activation of inflammation is there. And the greater velocity that we saw, because there is no remodeling, this greater velocity of the blood causes more fragmentation of syncytial trophoblasts. So more of these syncytial trophoblast cells go into the maternal circulation, and that causes more immunogenicity. And that's why, as we saw earlier, if immunogenicity is more, then the chances of preeclampsia are going to increase. So the issue is it's not inadequate, and it's the inadequate and not reduced placental perfusion which matters. And it is not always reduced perfusion, but adequacy is important. Now, this may seem confusing, but as we go ahead, we'll realize, why this is important. When tropoblastic mass is increased, like in multiple gestations and hydropic placenta, placental perfusion there is normal, not only normal, slightly more, in these situations, but still it is not adequate. And that's why these, patients also do have, preeclampsia like condition, in fact, early preeclampsia. So if you look at again this in the two-stage model and look at the second stage of maternal syndrome, this is characterized by hypertension and proteinuria. Pathological examination of organs show hemorrhage and necrosis, which suggests reduced oxygen perfusion. Also, other changes are seen in maternal organs like vasoconstriction, secondary to increased pressure sensitivity, activation of the coagulation cascade with microthrombi, loss of fluid from intravascular space that leads to a reduction in the circulating blood volume. Interestingly, all these are consistent with the endothelial dysfunction, which was described by Roberts quite some time back. So again, the important question comes whether inadequate placental perfusion alone is sufficient to cause preeclampsia. The answer is a big no. And why? Because women with fetal growth restriction and 1/3 women with preterm births also showed the same remodeling failure in the most instances. So that cannot be the only cause for preeclampsia. So there has to be a role of mother also. So, and that was the conclusion. The effect of inadequate perfusion also will depend on what is the situation or what is the constitution of the mother. Is the mother having other comorbidities or maternal diseases? What is the maternal lifestyle, whether it's like smoking and all, genetics of the mother, environment, and normal physiological changes of pregnancy, which itself is an inflammatory response. So what are the implications of all this? It implies that inadequate uterine perfusion may not only be insufficient to cause preeclampsia, but also not be fully necessary for preeclampsia in some cases. With a combination of maternal factors and inadequate placental perfusion together determining outcome, preeclampsia could occur with very reduced placental perfusion and almost no maternal contribution, or conversely with minimally reduced perfusion and a profoundly abnormal maternal complications. And this is very crucial proposition which may help us in explaining many subtypes of preeclampsia that we encounter. One such explanation was provided by Professor Redman while explaining the difference between early onset preeclampsia and late onset preeclampsia. So Redman explained that the early onset preeclampsia is because of classical failure of vascular remodeling leading to oxidative stress in the placenta and syncytial trophoblast, causing anti-angiogenic and anti-inflammatory effects. For late onset preeclampsia, he proposed a simile of pod-bound placenta, which means at term, some placentae overgrow the vascular supply leading to syncytial trophoblast stress and preeclampsia. So there is a peculiar theory that, if you allow any pregnancy to proceed, beyond, 40 weeks, say 41, 42 weeks, and, just as a hypothesis, everybody will develop, because the placenta will, be as they have said, pod-bound placenta, so that every placenta will outgrow the vasculature, and then everybody will have preeclampsia if the pregnancy is to proceed, say 50 or 51 weeks. So that is one type of. But what happens is, even in both conditions, the final outcome is syncytial trophoblast stress, and that's why we find that the effects are many times similar. So this was much a better model, but we are still left with identifying correct linkage of inadequate perfusion to the maternal syndrome. And that could be the reason why we are not able to predict or prevent preeclampsia, always we have been considering the long links. So this is due to the fact that in preeclampsia, the clinical presentation is variable, lab studies are variable that we know, and maternal populations are variable. And that is why many preventive strategies work in small populations, that is homogeneous populations, but not in larger heterogeneous population. And you take it a small dose of magnesium sulfate, particular type of preventive measures, a particular type of antihypertensive. Always it will show that it acts in some patients, but it has not acted in everyone. So there is a huge clinical variability in preeclampsia. Gestational age at occurrence is one variability. Severity of the symptoms we know is variable. Presence or absence of very high blood pressure. Sometimes you get even convulsions without blood pressure. Variable rate of progression, recurrent versus non-recurrent preeclampsia, with or without fetal growth restriction, with and without proteinuria, and with and without organ involvement. For example, liver and kidney. With and without obvious predisposing factors. So can these be various subtypes and not just variable presentation of a single entity called preeclampsia? There are reasons to think so. Remember, we always, and Dr. Hema will definitely, like this discussion that, diabetes was initially thought of as a one entity. Now we know that there are at least two entirely different entities, and that's diabetes type 1 and diabetes type 2. And now people are propagating that even GDM may be a third different entity which doesn't fit completely into these two. So it's possible that preeclampsia also has a similar issue. And why we are saying so? Because increased mortality is seen with early onset preeclampsia. And we know that 9.4 fold increase in cardiovascular deaths in women who had preeclampsia at less than 34 weeks of gestation. Then maternal risk is increased with recurrent preeclampsia. Then lab reports are quite variable. Some triglycerides are not increased in all preeclampsias, while some preeclampsias will show huge rise. Then oxidative stress, though we say it's very important, it's not evident in all cases of preeclampsia. And that's why sometimes we get only the fetal growth restriction and no inflammatory signs. That not all women with preeclampsia have elevated split. Though we talk of angiogenic factors, not every preeclamptic patient has elevated angiogenic factors. So, why we are not recognize this evidence for the subtypes before? Because we only focused on hypertension and proteinuria for a long time, then ignoring the variables seen in front of us and trying to fit available data in a single model to, trying to fit it to the either early onset or late onset preeclampsia. So in a way, not hiding data, using means and standard deviations or errors in presenting and conceptually. So what happens is when we try to fit the means and standard deviations for a particular data, then outliers get neglected and they remain hidden and nobody wonders about it. But outliers can be important, as we see here, and we cannot ignore them altogether. If we ignore them, then we land in trouble. So implication of these subtypes is, well, there is a bad news. And what's the bad news? That no matter what kind of predictors we have, predictors will not be able to predict all cases of preeclampsia. And treatment will not be able to prevent all cases of preeclampsia, a single treatment that is. But there is good news also, that predictors will predict some cases of preeclampsia at least, which is important. And directed treatment will prevent definitely some cases of preeclampsia. And now that's why we are getting now newer and newer actual treatments of preeclampsia, right, starting from trying to reduce the split levels by plasmapheresis to using either metformin or esomeprazole or even lately melatonin. So if we can identify subtypes of preeclampsia, we will be able to use many of these predictions and preventions in intelligent manner. So what are the potential subtypes? Clinical presentation can be one, subtype division, like early onset, then severe or mild, with or without FGR, which already we do. Then epidemiologically recurrent, or again early onset. Then pregnancy phenotype, demographics, depending on the race, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and BMI. Then pathophysiology, different paths to hypertension. How do we recognize the subtypes? First, we need the awareness. We have to be aware that the patient in front of us may not fit into a particular type. Not to assume that all preeclampsia is the same. Not to force all data to fit into one model. To pay attention to the outliers and be open-minded. Look at the data without preconceived ideas. And this is where the next landmark study comes in. And this study, a wonderful study carried out by Catherine Levy. What she has done is, the genome-wide study was done of gene expressions with, microarrays testing in many of these preeclampsia cases. In fact, they created a large clinically relevant human placental microarray, data set, applying completely unbiased, unsupervised clustering, just picked up the cases and did their, microarray studies and identified 3 clinically significant probable etiologies. So they had these, 3 or 4 clusters in these where the particular genes they could identify in particular clusters. And what they found there was a maternal cluster with healthy placentas and term delivery. So these were the healthy placentas, normal patients. Then canonical exhibiting expected clinical and histopathological features of preeclampsia. So typical, what we say is typical preeclampsia patients. Then there were immunological patients with severe fetal growth restriction and evidence of maternal antifetal rejection. And additional subclass of placenta, placentae was also revealed due to chromosomal abnormalities in these samples. So this is so solely based on the similarities in gene expression, they propose model of placental outcome and preeclampsia etiologies. The 4 different clusters they could identify with this gene expression profiling help us denoting different subtypes. And how do they look at the cluster 1? These are patients having normal expression of the genes, normal placentation and immune compatibility, healthy placentae, and they may have, normally they will go to term and deliver. They may have problems if they have infection, they may have preterm delivery, or if they have other maternal factors like, say, multiple pregnancy or the postdatism, they may develop late onset preeclampsia. Cluster 2 is the typical early onset cluster, placental dysfunction and hypoxic injuries. And the cluster 3, maternal placental compatibility, immune. Here what happens that the immunity is more. If maternal immunity is protective, then there will be no preeclampsia, but there will be fetal rejection or FGR. So finally, epigenetic and placental functions. This will matter. Emerging evidence suggests that the healthy placental function requires locus-specific methylation changes in the genes at specific time points in development. Maternal exposure to severe stressors such as environmental pollutants, nutritional factors, psychosocial stress, or maternal depression during pregnancy can increase the fetus's risk for suboptimal growth in wide range of organ systems and for developing a variety of disorders in the adulthood. These epigenetic regulations play a role in the pathophysiological preeclampsia. Interestingly, the placental gene expression changes have been shown to precede the preeclampsia, and candidate gene susceptibility loci where they occur are now being identified. This has wide-ranging implications in the discovery of predictive markers for preeclampsia, which may improve the ability to provide early treatment and monitor women with high-risk pregnancy. So finally, we are coming to the conclusion we need to determine the mechanisms driving subtypes for this, risk factors in the mother, age, BMI, nutrition, lifestyle comorbidities, maternal profile, pregnancy profile, then stressors during the before and pregnancy, and genetic and epigenetic profile, all will have to be considered in a particular patient if we are to predict preeclampsia in her case, or even decide the treatment in this case. So in conclusion, one would like to point out that this knowledge of existence of preeclampsia subclasses will be key for generation of robust biomarkers capable of identifying all these groups early in gestation and allow for the development and implementation of etiology-based treatments aimed at specific subclasses of this disorder. As in other fields of medicine, such as oncology, this personalized medicine approach will no doubt improve short and long-term health outcomes for both the mother and the child. Preeclampsia is a syndrome, not a disease. There is abundant evidence indicating subtypes of preeclampsia. Recognition of subtypes and deciphering different pathophysiologies for early prediction and to direct individualized therapy as per the subtype is the future. So let's look at every case of potential preeclampsia with close lens and not miss out on the subtleties it presents. And that's why let's not get, sort of be dogmatic and say, okay, this is the thing that is right and this is the thing that's going to work, nothing else is going to work, or this is the way we are going to predict all cases of preeclampsia, and if you don't use these prediction methods, you are going to go wrong. No, we have still a way to go, and we still need to have absolutely open mind in dealing with preeclampsia and hypertensive diseases. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you, Sanjay sir, for a crisp talk and making the things very clear to all of us about where are we standing in preeclampsia and where are we going. To moving on ahead, we'll take the question and answers. You can put it on the chat box or the Q&A box. We're going to take all the question and answers at the end of it. There are a couple of questions though. Now we move on to our next talk with Dr. Hema Divakar ma'am. She is well known to all of us, and the lovely, lively Dr. Hema Divakar. I present to you. Just a formal introduction for her. We all know her very well. Apart from that, she's a medical director at Divakar Specialty Hospital and an opinion leader and past president of FOXI 2013, vice president for FIGO PNCD committee since 2015, senior consultant ops and gynae with over 3 decades of experience. That's a vast and a huge experience. We've got both the learned, experienced speakers for all of you. And ambassador for the International Organization of OB-GYN for FIGO since 2016 to 2018, technical advisory group member for Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, Government of India, and advocate for delivering quality healthcare and capacity building, and influencer for social legal issues relating to women's health. FIGO Women Achiever Award was awarded to Dr. Hema Divakar in 2015, Global Asian of the Year 2018, Excellence in Women's Health by the Ministry of Maternal Health, CME for the Excellence Award for Artists, Next Brand Award for Artists for her, CSR Times Award and CSR Impact Award for Divakar Service Trust. Here I present to you the lively Dr. Hema Divakar with her talk on decoding atypical preeclampsia.
Namaskar. Thank you, Raki, for your kind introduction. And huge congratulations to you for doing a fabulous job as the committee chair for endocrinology, changing the very face and very format of the discussions with some very insightful programs that you have presented over the last many weeks. And thanks to McLeod's for bringing us all on a common platform, and an exceptional presentation by Dr. Gupte with the looking back, moving forward, where we stand and perhaps where we ought to go. So when I was approached for this talk, something around preeclampsia, eclampsia, I said, hey, it's very atypical of me to speak about preeclampsia, eclampsia, because usually I doing the talks around sweet things like diabetes in pregnancy. So the PNCD committee, dear friends, pregnancy and NCD, deals with many verticals. One is the hyperglycemia, one is the hypertension, another is the nutrition, anemia, cancer, so on, all the NCDs which come forth. So they said, yes, it is atypical. Therefore, we want you to speak on atypical preeclampsia, eclampsia. So I said, well, then two important consolations. One was I knew Dr. Gupte is on the show. So it's morally very encouraging. And yes, as I have confessed before, any or many questions, we would attempt to do our best to respond to them. But I feel very encouraged by Gupte's presentation, which is making us known to the fact that the pioneers and the researchers and many clinicians all around the world still do not know much about eclampsia, preeclampsia. So we are okay on talking about it with whatever little knowledge you have, because my passion area is implementation. And the best practices and recommendation which the FIGO defines for the low middle income countries, I'm very passionate about disseminating that to each one of you to help you move ahead. And Raki, you will notice that the questions in the chat box are already around the issues of how to manage, what to give, what not to give, etc. So taking the cue from what Dr. Gupte has said, yes, the traditional teaching, preeclampsia is hypertension plus proteinuria that develops in the second half after 20 weeks of pregnancy or within 48 hours after delivery. Well, he has already said it needs a revisit because there are many atypical things happening. In fact, it was, as alluded to by Dr. Gupte, revisited in 2014. And what did they say then? Hypertension after 20 weeks, okay, but it may or may not have proteinuria. It may have any one of these, either proteinuria or maternal organ dysfunction, because major multiple organs are affected with this, and or fetal growth restriction. So as he said, many causes for fetal growth restriction, especially in low middle income countries where we have already the burden of undernutrition and genetically, small for gestation babies. So like more thought process and more confusions added. Well then, what is atypical? What is so atypical about the cases of the atypical preeclampsia, eclampsia? Contrary to the traditional definition and even the revisited definition, if the eclampsia develops earlier than 20 weeks, or instead of the typical within 48 hours, if it develops days after the delivery, that is well after 48 hours, and have some signs and symptoms of preeclampsia. And please note that without the usual hypertension, without the usual proteinuria, it's okay. It is preeclampsia, eclampsia, but it is atypical. So atypical preeclampsia is not so very well recognized. And the point for us as OBGYNs to remember is, if you don't recognize it and don't pay attention and don't do anything about it, maternal morbidity, perinatal morbidity is sure to rise. So you need to know what it is and what to do about it. And the problems with atypical forms is the timely diagnosis and management, as I said, is very critical. And what the mind doesn't know, it will not translate into the practice. So Sibai and Stella, these are very big names in the world of hypertensive disorders in pregnancy, just as how Dr. Gupte said. Chris Redman, I had the pleasure of meeting him 2 decades ago when he was in Bengaluru for a conference, and little did I know that if I would have paid more attention to what he said, maybe I would have been better off in deliberating on atypical preeclampsia. So 4 subclinical groups that they divided into. One is that preeclampsia or eclampsia appearing before 20 weeks. Non-proteinuric gestational hypertension means hypertension is there, but there is no proteinuria. Or there is no hypertension, that is, patient is normotensive, but still she has proteinuria. And the last of it, either it's preeclampsia, eclampsia, or HELLP syndrome, but it is happening at an atypical time beyond 48 hours. So these 4 subgroups, one is in the timing and one is in the plus or minuses of what she could or she could not have. Message to the OBGYNs is that you must maintain a very high level of suspicion, irrespective of the gestational age at the time of onset or irrespective of number of days after delivery. When you suspect this, be ready to take immediate steps. It is very unpredictable in its onset. So either during pregnancy or post-delivery, both the mother and the baby prior to delivery and, of course, the mother post-delivery can get into trouble. So awareness regarding this and also avoiding misdiagnosis or overdiagnosis is really, really important. So the objective of this presentation on the atypical preeclampsia eclampsia is to increase the awareness of non-classic or atypical types and a stepwise approach towards how we would go about the diagnosis and treatment. We need a well-formulated plan. As usual, we need to have a checklist on the maternal risk factors, the clinical and the laboratory findings. If we do some imaging, depending on the context where it's needed, then we do need to collate those findings into the clinical picture. We need to double check on the time of onset in relation to the gestational age and delivery. First issue about development of preeclampsia or eclampsia earlier than 20 weeks. Most often, with or without the fetus, this is associated with molar or hydropid degeneration of the placenta. Very, very rarely, exceedingly rarely, it happens without the molar regeneration. So the answer to this will be very simple. When on the scan, you find a molar regeneration and then you have a complexity of a preeclampsia type, even though typical definition of after 20 weeks doesn't fit in, it is an atypical presentation. Convulsions during the first half of the pregnancy, therefore, if she has hypertension and proteinuria in the first half of pregnancy, that is early in pregnancy, it should be considered as eclampsia unless proved otherwise. There is another clue that you can pick up. If you've done the NT scan and then, you study the uterine artery Doppler and have found the classical notching, the sensitivity of this test is established very well with the early onset preeclampsia. 87 to 96% of them will have this notching. So in the absence of other diseases, the treatment of choice for such pregnancies will be, she is, remember, 14, 16 weeks and having convulsions and having uterine artery notching. You have to presume the convulsions are due to eclampsia and give her the magnesium sulfate without any delay, antihypertensive treatment, and then put an end to that pregnancy. So life-saving. So quick check on 2 things. One is that ultrasound scan for molar or partial molar pregnancy. Second is the uterine artery Doppler. What should you rule out in these cases? Because as OBGYNs, we always think of, what we generally know and deal with. But there can be other things beyond this. So this is an early onset. This is atypical. Could it be a lupus nephritis? Could it be a hemolytic uremic syndrome? Could it be an antiphospholipid antibody syndrome or a thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura? Well, you have to think of these and as a differential diagnosis, rule them out. So how do you rule them out? So normally, if you need to rule out all these 4 issues that I have shortlisted, a complete blood count, a liver panel, lactic dehydrogenase should be considered to rule out the thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. If it's an undiagnosed renal disease, it may be worthwhile doing a 24-hour urine collection and the renal function test to endorse your thought process on the renal disease. systemic lupus erythematosus, anti-nuclear antibody screen, anti-mitochondrial antibody serum, the serology and serum biochemistry. All of these will put your diagnosis spot on systemic lupus erythematosus. And antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, this is one of, again, a common armamentarium that we are used to, so you can figure that out with the anticardiolipin and lupus antigen test. Let's move on to some cases to see how these atypical women will present. Just look at this case where the blood pressure has been normal, but you have found only proteinuria. This is a 20-year-old patient who was admitted at 37 weeks, and her prenatal visits, everything has been normal, including the BP, which is still recorded even at this visit as 120/80. Some repeat recordings even show 110/70. No prodrome of hypertensive disease, no laboratory abnormalities. Platelet counts, liver enzymes, LDH, electrolytes, glucose, everything normal. But she had 3+ proteinuria on the dipstick. Any which ways, she presented with contractions, so she was delivered, and fetal outcome was good, 2,800 grams, nice baby, and the attention was more towards the BP being normal and the proteinuria was ignored. Following the delivery, the BP increased suddenly to 150/100, and repeat measures consistently showed the diastolic as 100. Then she had a generalized convulsion lasting 5 to 10 seconds. 2 hours later, she developed sudden blindness, an occipital headache, and a myoclonic seizure, particularly involving the right upper extremity. Well then, as is known to us, magnesium sulfate was given for 24 hours as the patient seemed to have atypical eclampsia. This was normotensive in the entire duration of her pregnancy. Proteinuria was the only finding just around the time of delivery, and post-delivery her BP shot up, and this was the atypical presentation. After the MAC-SELF, she did not have any seizures. Subsequently, her BP was monitored high for a few days, but did get under control, normalized on the 3rd postpartum day, 930 milligram per deciliter of proteinuria in the 24-hour urine collection. And because this was not typically as preeclampsia, a cranial MRI was also done. It was reported unremarkable, and she was discharged very soon after that. So in case of the hypertensive disorders, the hypertension that we picked up post-delivery, which was quickly followed by the seizures, headache or blurred vision with or without seizures, well after 48 hours after delivery, magnesium sulfate therapy should be initiated without delay. The typical loading dose as given in literature is 6 grams to be administered over 30 minutes, maintenance dose of 2 grams per hour for at least 24 hours after the last seizure. We have different schedules of dosages approved by the government in our own country. The urine output, the blood pressure, the maternal symptoms should be monitored closely after discontinuing the magnesium sulfate. If the patient has severe hypertension alone without convulsions, then antihypertensive therapy should be administered to stabilize the blood pressure. And there have been questions about what if labetalol, TID doesn't control? You have to add another group of antihypertensives like nifedipine and alpha-methyl-dopa, which is now the 3rd on the priority. Multiple drug dosages may also sometimes be required. If the condition does not respond to such a therapy and the patient continues to have convulsions, then you have to rule out some neurological problems, and therefore the magnetic resonance imaging is often asked for. So we had to be alert. Could we have prevented this from happening? We saw that the patient had only proteinuria, and per se, it did not really alarm us. Despite the absence of hypertension, the patient could have been watched more closely for a postpartum rise in BP and pain management, and may have prevented a sudden increase in BP that provoked the convulsions. So absence of classical features, dear friends, resulting in unnecessary cross consultations and many investigations, and you're delaying the diagnosis and treatment of magnesium sulfate infusions. Please never do that. Don't delay. Giving it on time is so much worthwhile, and it is so true that many healthcare providers who are not familiar with this, because a case of hypertensive disorder, they've already marked that high BP, and when they note a normal BP, their minds are quite relaxed and they don't seem to pay much attention peripartum and postpartum events. But if and when the patient does have a high BP escalating and the convulsions, don't delay the quick institution of the therapy. So be quick in starting the treatment. Even minor clues in the diagnosis, such as marginally elevated BP or trace proteinuria, may be critical for the appropriate and timely management. One should always be aware of atypical presentation. As I said, maintain a high degree of suspicion. This is what we typically say for ectopic pregnancy. Before the era of beta HCGs escalating, we always had the dictum of be sure if your uterus is empty on the early scans, be very wary of ectopic pregnancy. So similar mindset is called for here as well, and you must be ready to take immediate steps. And valuable time should not be spent in conducting detailed investigations. This I especially remark because all the tests that I have mentioned are very elaborate, may not be available in every nook and corner of the country. Just because you have to get the test results and wait on, do not delay the treatment. Give her the antihypertensives and magnesium sulfate. So having illustrated one such case in the antenatal, so postpartum hypertensive disorders. Here again, postpartum typically after 48 hours, which we call atypical eclampsia. If the convulsions are there, you are going to give the same magnesium sulfate. If there is no response, again she throws repeated convulsions. Neuroimaging is more or less a part of these investigations, because neurologic symptoms, facial defects, with or without hypertension, there may be a central venous thrombosis and other issues there which you may have to tackle, inclusive of a cross consultation with the neurologist. Sometimes the postpartum phase, suddenly the BP which was normal, only the BP itself shoots up and there may be no convulsions. Here, acute and aggressive management with intravenous hydralazine or labetalol, and later the nifedipine, and chronic management, as I've just alluded to. You may try labetalol, add on nifedipine. Sometimes diuretics may also be needed. As I said, methyl dopa, and the whole array with the cross consultation of a physician may also be worthwhile. Let's see another case of this illustrating this postpartum eclampsia or hypertension. This is a 30-year-old primary. She underwent a C-section at 31 weeks for severe IUGR, absent end-diastolic flow, oligohydramnios, severe hypertension, and unrelenting headache, no proteinuria. At the time of discharge, her BP was 170/110, and labetalol was advised, and she was anyway sent home. They said BP will settle, you continue this, and you come on such and such a day. But within 3 days of going home, she presented with severe hypertension, intermittent headache, and through a convulsion. So very aggressive management of the post-delivery BP is called for, and you may ask for a surveillance earlier than what you would have normally asked. Please pay attention. The patient going home, maybe because of the protocol of the institute or the bed capacity or the paying capacity, you send her home quickly, say it's only the hypertension, it will anyhow settle, and continue this antihypertensives. No, you need to inform her also about the signs and symptoms, and a prompt recall and a continued, more aggressive and rigorous surveillance is what will help you save the case. Yet again, a 25-year-old referred from the community health center with multiple episodes of tonic and clonic convulsions, altered consciousness, restlessness. The delivery was way back. She delivered at home 3 weeks back without any evidence of preeclampsia during her pregnancy. This patient received a loading dose, which is typical in the PHCs, the 14 grams total, with the 5 milligrams intramuscular and the 4 gram intravenous. When the patient came into the tertiary center, patient was restless, semi-conscious, disoriented, did not respond well to the verbal command, and she had meningeal irritation. The BP was 140/100. She had injuries on her tongue because of the repeated convulsions she had had, and the patellar reflexes, neck rigidity were absent, and bilateral plantar was equivocal with the pinpoint pupil and sluggish reacting to light. Cardiorespiratory system was within the normal limits, and the abdominal examination in which way shows that uterus was well involuting. Again, the magnesium sulfate therapy, it was important because we said that in the atypical, even if it's 3 weeks after delivery, she had thrown a convulsion, and rightly so, the lower center or the PHC had instituted the magnesium sulfate therapy in its usual course, which is quite the right thing to do. The condition did not respond to this. We could have continued that same therapy, but the reflexes were absent, and the overdose of the magnesium sulfate should also be avoided. In the higher center, the neuroimaging with MRI and angiography to rule out the presence of cerebral diseases, the classic finding in many cases of these late onset eclampsia is posterior reversible encephalopathy syndrome called the PRESS, which more and more of us are getting exposed to. The further investigations, therefore, an immediate neurology consultation and the routine magnesium levels in this case, because the patient may have needed extra load of magnesium, but we need to be careful about the toxicity. The CT brain was advised, and subsequent doses of Maxil were withheld because of the absence patellar reflex, and the patient was in the ICU. Again, the intravenous antihypertensives were given. The CT was normal. The serum electrolyte, blood sugar, LFT, RFT, platelet, coagulation profile. See, all of these cannot be done in the lower centers, and they cannot be waiting forever and ever for the investigation reports to come. Urinary protein was 3+, and the liver enzymes were altered. So this was more like a postpartum HELLP syndrome with the kind of an atypical presentation. The MRI of the brain was done, which showed the post-seizure changes. So the diagnosis of breast was made in this case because she was having a high blood pressure with the proteinuria and the altered enzymes, and her EEG, CT, MRI were, however, normal. There was no abnormal pathology. Diagnosis was based on clinical presentation and the biochemical parameters, and by excluding other causes by performing various appropriate investigations. So here again, the differential diagnosis, gynecology and neurology needs to put their brains together, because she was in coma, she had focal neurological deficits, and atypical eclampsia, as we call it, needs to be differentiated by the neurological evaluation, which needs to rule out the other things. The possible HELLP syndrome is also suspected when patients with persistent nausea, vomiting, epigastric pain, and mucosal bleeding with or without hypertension. Here again, at 48 hours or well after that, post-delivery should be evaluated for a possibility of HELLP syndrome, because it's very atypical for us to even put down the diagnosis of HELLP syndrome well after many days after delivery. So these women should typically have their platelet counts, liver enzymes, coagulation studies, as we typically do, abdominal imaging studies to corroborate with the clinical findings. And in most cases, if all of these happen earlier to 20 weeks, then the ultimate thing that you would have done is deliver the patient. But please remember, it can get worse after delivery, and it can also present to you well after 48 hours. That's what is termed as atypical, and one should have prompt medical evaluation. Lastly, coming to when there is such a mixed picture, so much of atypical findings, can there be something which can prompt us, like how we said the uterine artery notching? It may prompt us earlier in pregnancy itself that this may be in a complex fitting in the pre-eclampsia eclampsia spectrum. Similarly, chronic kidney disease, lupus nephritis, chronic hypertension, thrombocytopenia, and a variety of other things which I mentioned in differential diagnosis, which are typically not in the armamentarium of an obstetrician. Can we use the PIGF in defining preeclampsia when the diagnosis is uncertain? Well, just the last 2 slides to give you a brief about this. Several circulating angiogenic markers have been proposed to either predict or confirm the diagnosis of preeclampsia. These markers may be useful to clinically rule out the diagnosis of preeclampsia and focus more on what other things it could be. So what are these markers? Serum placental growth factor, the PLGF, which is decreased, then the tyrosine 1 receptor, serum soluble endocrine levels, all these under the control of the Green Array laboratories of Dr. Gupte, where further research is definitely going to be performed on these novel markers. In fact, he has already suggested that this will come in very, very handy in countries like ours, because these tests have a potential to assist the risk stratification of women who are at high risk of developing preeclampsia, singling out those with low PIGF to receive a more intensive surveillance to avoid the adverse outcomes such as growth restriction, fetal demise is the way forward. There are certain studies like the PARROT, PARROT, which expands into placental growth factor to assess and diagnose hypertensive pregnant women. A stepped wedge trial is underway to determine whether adding the PIGF to the current armamentarium of management will prompt us towards the diagnosis that this may fit into typical or atypical cases. This patient is potentially going to develop the preeclampsia, eclampsia silently though, but you have your clue before. So focus on probable clinical impacts of PIGF. The most likely area of clinical impact is in point of care. If we can do this diagnostic testing, just like how we do the urine pregnancy testing, the TIP6 testing, the glucometer testing, if we can do the growth factor estimation in a point of care test and pick up those with really, really low values and segregate them as a subset to maintain a different type of a protocol for surveillance and track them for the timely delivery and prevention of complications, that will be the way forward. They're also contemplating that the role of PIGF may be also in the monitoring and prognosis. When you have to decide when to intervene, depending on these levels, maybe it will give you a clue that if you wait anymore, she's going to get into more trouble. Can we predict that already? Well, it needs a little more evidence, but as of now, the biggest impact will remain in women presenting with a suspected disease. You're not very sure, but as a point of care, you do this and you may get your answers for early detection as well as early intervention. So this is a very atypical way of saying thank you. Many languages, which I do not know, but all speak the same language of being in a humble attitude of gratitude for all that our previous scientists and researchers have presented to us and helping us evolve in a much stronger and better way, because, dear friends, as you know, preeclampsia, eclampsia, and BPH still remain in the highest ranking, killing our mothers and babies, which are so preventable. So every attempt for everybody, every time, everywhere should be made to make the healthcare ecosystem better. So thank you so very much for your kind attention. And I have learned a lot about atypical preeclampsia, eclampsia in preparation for the deliberation today. But there is a long way to go for each one of us to implement this in practice. So I urge you to do the simple little things like accurate measurement of the blood pressure, MAP or mean arterial blood pressure when you call. We have to at least check the blood pressure in every antenatal woman twice and take the mean of that, or take it in each of the arm and take a mean of that, which I'm sure that it has not got implemented into our routine clinical practice. So simple things which make a big difference. We do hope we see a better phase of the girls and women in this country very soon. Namaste.
Thank you, Dr. Hema ma'am, for the elaborate understanding of the atypical preeclampsia with all the different types of atypical preeclampsia cases you've tried to make us understand. There are a couple of questions for both my learned speakers for today. And I think most of the questions have been answered in the talks as per se also. This was a rapid fire question type of a question which was there by Dr. Kattam Reddy from Nellore. She's asking what is the maximum dose of labetalol?
Labetalol
And my questions are to both of you. Yeah. Anybody could do.
Labetalol can go as 2400 grams per day. Usually we do not require it. If you require it, more than 800, then it is better to, adjuvant,
add another.
Yeah, add, nifedipine or whatever else you have, But maximum you ask, it's, 2 gram and above.
Yeah. Sir, after how much amount of the dosage do we think of adding another second dose?
So the first thing is when do you, how do you select the dose? It depends on the patient's pulse rate. If the pulse rate is on the higher side, more than 100, then go for labetalol as a first treatment. If it is less than 100, then don't go for labetalol, then use nifedipine as your treatment, And if you require labetalol, as I said, more than 800 in a daytime, then you can think of adding nifedipine. While nifedipine, if you are titrating and using every 4 hours and you do not get a response, then you can add on labetalol.
Thank you.
Typically, Rakhi, one tablet TID, 2 TIDs. That is the generally the mindset of the clinicians are that enough is enough. That adds on to a substantial amount of dosage, though it is less than the standard allowed dose. So just don't keep on stretching on the same. Just change your route by adding yet another antihypertensive, and I think that would be worthwhile. Yeah.
Definitely. And is PIH associated with preeclampsia? I think that has been answered.
Basically, gestational hypertension is what we now mean by PIH. Now we don't use the term PIH. So, and preeclampsia is where gestational hypertension with the new definition with added proteinuria or fetal growth restriction or any organ involvement that we talked about. So if any of these things are present, then it is preeclampsia. Somebody has asked 220, 160 BP at 6 weeks of pregnancy.
Yes.
That's a disastrous situation. It's not preeclampsia, it's a chronic hypertension. You would investigate the patient thoroughly for why she's having such a high blood pressure and renal disorders, liver problems, everything you have to look at, and of course retinopathy and everything before allowing that pregnancy to proceed also.
Ideally, preeclampsia occurs in the first trimester, what I...
Yeah.
I would urge all our viewers to stick to newer terminologies and declutter their minds about all the old acronyms which caused confusion. It is pregnancy, so it is something to do with gestation. So gestational hypertensive disorder, gestational hyperglycemia. If you keep your thinking as simple as that, she's pregnant and she's having high blood pressure, she's pregnant and she's having high blood sugar, you have to do something about it. Where and when it originated, well, that is for you to probe, but don't be carried away by the terminologies to interfere with your management.
Dr. Kausar from Mumbai is asking, can there be hereditary factors involved in the development of preeclampsia?
Most definitely. That's where we talked about, all these genomic studies. They were clusters of genes, and long back, Chelsea was the first one to, talk about this. He has done a lot of studies and, found out that even in, twins, in the grandmother to mother to children, the children were born themselves small for day. And that's where, I must mention before we close that we have now what we call as a Gestosis score. And this Gestosis score the app is available. Our friend Dr. Mandrupkar has made an app, and it is freely available on Google's Play Store. And these are the risk factors mentioned. And if we look at the risk factors, then that itself will tell us where we stand as far as that particular case is concerned, and even as far as atypical preeclampsia, and how to even suspect in those cases. All these things. Look at the Gestosis score. If high risk factor is there, then something is lurking, and you can suspect. So the history is extremely important in each patient.
Dr. Asha from Mumbai is asking, how will you define preeclampsia in the pre-existing maternal hypertension, essential hypertension patient?
Right. So, it's called as superimposed preeclampsia, always. And whereas I said, if only hypertension was there, proteinuria is added to that, or organ involvement is added to that, then it is to be called as superimposed, preeclampsia in that situation.
Dr. Meenakshi is asking, should all patients with proteinuria non-hypertensive be considered for prophylactic MgSO4, magnesium sulfate?
That's interesting. No, not really, because yes, there can be, even conversion without hypertension and only with preeclampsia. But if you have only proteinuria, first investigate her for any renal issues that she has. And if you have ruled that out, then, one of the ways that you can find out is if you're carefully watching the patient. As I said, look at her history, whether she has any comorbidities like, gestational diabetes, high BMI, then history of, previous hypertension in preeclampsia in previous pregnancy, hereditary history of preeclampsia, or, assisted reproductive measures taken for this pregnancy. As the Gestosis score says, there are almost 26 different risk factors which we need to consider. And if that is so, again, in second, as Dr. Hema rightly pointed out, you have to be very careful in taking your blood pressure in first trimester. And if you are very consistent and careful, you will find there is always a little drop in the second trimester. And if you don't get this drop, you have to be, alert in the second trimester. Then, in around delivery time, make sure that not even a little bit of hypertension is there when you administer, methergin or methergin for this patient. And especially if you are using routinely, methyl ergometrin, and you find that immediately after that, patient complains of headache, nausea, take the blood pressure at that time. You will find that the BP has, suddenly shot up, and that may reduce after the methyl ergometrin dose. The effect goes on, but this is the patient you have to watch for the next 3 or 4 days, because she is the one who is going to land with a typical preeclampsia, the classical case that Dr. Hema has, described. And always the blood pressure increases on 3rd and 4th day. So before, sending the patient home, always make sure that you're measured the blood pressure before you are discharging her.
We've got the last question from Dr. Meenakshi. She's asking, which is a better post-operative period drug, the labetalol or nifedipine? Which is the drug of choice?
Okay, so immediately after the post-operative, nifedipine is better. But remember, after the patient has delivered, and even if she's lactating, you can use the other antihypertensives which are otherwise not allowed, like ARBs and like all the Leprils and all. I prefer going on to drugs like Stamlo and all, which can be very safely used in this. So you can use all your other drugs, sartans and all those things after the patient has delivered. The contraindication goes away because the baby is not inside, and like lactation doesn't have any problem with that. So you now, once the patient has delivered, you got the whole
battery of drugs.
Yeah, so Raki, actually the messages are pretty much simple, because the two mainstream questions which have been posed are around the magnesium sulfate with only proteinuria, for example. So what we're saying is, if the Gestosis score is high, if the proteinuria is present, if those symptoms also emerge, even if her BP is normal, please look out consistently, constantly that BP may increase and then treat it accordingly. And then, your magnesium sulfate and antihypertensives. And it is so simple that it's not a rocket science. Antihypertensive also take that too. We've got 2-3 main options. So it's not so confusing to start with labetalol, to add on nifedipine, and a third drug if required, and IV hydrolysate to keep it handy wherever it's available, etc. So it is, on the whole, if you're watchful, I do not think that we should lose even a single patient by delayed diagnosis and, unnecessary investigations, untimely, reluctant action. That should not be the case. That is the main message that Dr. Gupta and myself want to give. It is something so preventable that each one of us will be failing in our duty if you do not prevent the deaths because of early detection and timely action in all of these cases.
A point I would like to add upon and have your opinion also, that if suppose the patient is not getting controlled on one drug, we add on the second drug. And after adding the second drug also, if she is not getting controlled, then I think we should not linger around and we should think for her patient's interest and think for the delivery rather than waiting for keep on adding on the drugs on it.
Absolutely.
And we remember that so-called, mild preeclampsia can suddenly become a severe preeclampsia, and that's why, we have to be always on our toes, even if it is mild preeclampsia. And I'm happy that Dr. Hema mentioned about, PLGF and point of care. Soon we are hoping, we are validating on serum endoglin and as a point of care test. And we are hoping pretty soon, once it is validated, we can make it available as a point of care test, which will help us in predicting and especially diagnosing in difficult cases. Okay, this is preeclampsia, and even prognosticating, hopefully, depending on the levels of endocrine.
We've got 2 more questions, sir. This is from Dr. Preeti from Nagpur. She says that there's a 19-year-old patient with history of complete loss of vision since morning and 3 episodes of convulsions presenting in the same evening by 5 o'clock at 29 weeks in drowsy state and poor Bishop's score, long cervix, estimated baby weight is 1 kg. What next? Should we induce her for delivery or go in for a cesarean section?
See, she has so many high-risk situations. So there is no question. You just stabilize her, start her magnesium sulfate and antihypertensive.
Absolutely.
That all the measures, send a lab and definitely section her. There is no question about
and a big counseling for this patient, as it is, the patient is 29 weeks. A counseling by the neonatologist is important because the patient is 29 weeks. And
of course, important thing is don't forget your steroids, don't forget, magnesium sulfate, which is also for
neuroprotection.
That is important. And she's 19 years, so counsel the whole family also that, this is wrong, she should have been pregnant in the first place.
Yes.
Yeah. And, for these patients, Raki, oftentimes the conviction with which the clinician talks about contraception, because really this is a case of high-risk pregnancy, which has been also, unfortunately needed intervention. But at least another 2 to 3 years, she must not conceive, because in the eagerness to have a live baby, they will push her into the next pregnancy very early. So in a way that they are convinced that spacing should be done in order to avoid the risk should also be very, very strongly emphasized.
Because at 19 years of age, as it is, we're going to get a lot of problems, maternal problems coming down during pregnancy.
Absolutely. Quite right.
And we've got another last message, I hope, from Dr. Meenakshi. What should be the ideal mode of delivery in patients with poor Bishop's score with preeclampsia? Okay.
The thing is depending on, rest of the situations, how high risk it is, whether she is stabilized or not stabilized. But remember, prostaglandins are not contraindicated for, for example, Cerviprime or, something we can use to improve the Bishop score. And then if everything is stable, then we can induce and go for normal delivery. Definitely. It's not, normal delivery is not contraindicated in, preeclampsia. That's the message that we must give. Otherwise, people rush the minute they find preeclampsia, go cesarean section, that's not the thing to do.
McLeod should give a special prize to Meenakshi for asking maximum number of questions today.
Definitely. Today we've got two learned past presidents of Foxy and FIGO representatives with us. That's why I think more questions, and it is a very beautiful learned talk. And I feel every person should, who have not joined also, should see at least the recording of it and to learn in depth about the preeclampsia and all the
And
where we stand, all the questions, where are we going with the preeclampsia, all the...
Yeah, I think you can, through your committee, you can start, just like we had, medical legal helpline, I think preeclampsia helpline, so we can all answer the questions, when the patients are there in front of them, we will be very happy to do that, advise at a particular time what needs to be done. I think we will be doing a lot of good and maybe even saving some lives doing that.
And also, Raki, on this forum, I would urge that, it was such a strong initiative by Dr. Gupta and team to establish a eclampsia registry. We really, want to revisit that, revive that. And if everybody puts in their cases there, the trends may be changing for all you know. Because there are so many new era problems, and we will be able to learn our lessons from there and set something very different for the need of our own country. So we really urge you to join hands in putting the data out there to help us look back and recrystallize our thought process of what can be best for our women here.
Thank you, Emma. That's very important.
Sir, I'll from my committee, I will definitely get back to you on this note, sir, for the preeclampsia question and answer sessions.
Sure.
We'll look forward to it, definitely. We'll just draft the lines and then get back.
Thank you. It was wonderful, Raki. Very well conducted and program. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you,
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, MacLeod. It was wonderful. Lovely program. I learned a lot.
I think my video is not there, but I must say that this weekend afternoon is well spent with a lot of practical insights of preeclampsia with two eminent speakers who really has given us a lot of valuable insights. Dr. Sanjay Gupta and Dr. Hema Divakar, we are really thankful for you, because the session of Dr. Sanjay Gupta and Dr. Hema was so simple and interesting that a layman person like me also can understand the things in depth. And no doubt, a big thanks to Dr. Rakhi Singh, who has really conducted the session so well. A lot of question and answers and a lot of innovative things has come out into the forum, particularly making the suggestion which was given by Dr. Hema regarding making a data bank of the preeclampsia cases. This is something which is really interesting. And I'm sure that this type of the innovative thoughts can make the preeclampsia a very simple and easy to treat diagnosis. So on behalf of MacLeod's, I really thank you to each one of you, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, Dr. Hema Divakar, Dr. Rakhi Singh, at the same time, Dr. Aditi, who is from our MacLeod's, and the same time, the agency who has conducted this program flawlessly. Thanks a lot once again. And I request all my delegates to please do patronize our product, Labetalol, brand Labitamac. Thank you very much to every one of you. Thanks a lot. It was really a good evening, good afternoon, spent with a lot of knowledge. Thanks a lot.